The dawn of June 22, 1941, brought with it one of the most devastating and consequential military operations in human history. Without warning, Adolf Hitler unleashed Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion ever attempted, a colossal strike aimed directly at Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union. It was the culmination of years of Hitler's ideological obsession, planning, and belief that Soviet communism was the greatest threat to his vision of a German-dominated Europe. At the border, 3.8 million Axis soldiers surged forward across an 1,800-mile front, expecting to complete a 5-month operation that would shatter the Soviet Union before winter arrived. German commanders were confident, veterans of earlier victories, and convinced that this new campaign would bring the same quick and decisive results. The initial shock was overwhelming. The Red Army, caught off guard not only by the timing, but also by its own internal weaknesses, reeled under the sudden blow. Stalin's officer corps had been severely hollowed out by political purges during the late 1930s, leaving many units with inexperienced and fearful leaders. The Soviet front lines collapsed in multiple places, and German armored spearheads struck deep into the heart of Soviet territory. The Wehrmacht organized its offensive around 3 massive army groups, each with its own strategic objective: Leningrad in the north, Moscow in the center, and Kiev in the south. For the first several weeks, German momentum seemed unstoppable. In the far north, Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb's Army Group North drove relentlessly toward Leningrad, pushing to within roughly 135 miles of the city within the first month. Finnish allies from the north advanced simultaneously, putting immense pressure on the Soviet defenses. Meanwhile, Army Group Center under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock delivered an even more devastating blow. In just 30 days, his armored units punched 480 miles into Soviet territory, capturing key cities and threatening Moscow itself. Smolensk, considered the gateway to Moscow, fell on July 17th, a major psychological and strategic victory for the Germans. To the south, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's Army Group South swept through Ukraine, capturing wide territories and securing enormous economic and agricultural resources. It looked as if the Soviet Union was collapsing under the weight of the German assault. Back in Moscow, Stalin faced catastrophe. Despite having 800,000 men designated for the capital's defense, only about 25 divisions were fully operational. Many lacked equipment, others were still forming, and most were already exhausted from previous engagements. Yet Hitler believed the decisive blow still needed to be struck, and so the German High Command initiated Operation Typhoon, the assault on Moscow, on September 30, 1941. Army Group Center, already far advanced but stretched thin, prepared to break through several layers of defensive lines constructed around key cities leading to Moscow. The opening stages were brutal. The 2nd Panzer Group captured Orel, located 75 miles south of the Soviets' first major defensive belt, only 3 days after Operation Typhoon began. In rapid succession, the panzers seized Bryansk, while the German Second Army pressed from the south, encircling the Soviet 3rd and 13th Armies. To the north, the 3rd and 4th Panzer Armies surged forward, creating a massive pincer movement that trapped 4 additional Soviet armies. In these vast encirclements, the Germans captured over 663,000 prisoners, adding to the nearly 3 million Red Army soldiers taken since the start of Barbarossa. These enormous losses seemed to suggest that Moscow was on the verge of collapse and that the Soviet Union might indeed fall. By mid-October, German armored units were closing in. On October 13th, the 3rd Panzer Group was only 87 miles from the capital. Panic spread through Moscow. Martial law was declared, government records were evacuated, and preparations were made to defend the city street by street. But just as the Germans appeared to be on the brink of triumph, the weather began to change. Heavy rain drenched the region, turning the poorly paved Russian roads into endless rivers of mud. German tanks, built with narrow tracks designed for speed rather than rough terrain, sank into the mire and became nearly immobile. Trucks and artillery pieces bogged down, horses struggled, and infantry marched knee-deep through sticky sludge. Supplies slowed to a crawl, and the rapid mechanized advance that had carried the Germans so far began to falter. On October 31st, German commanders temporarily halted their advance to reorganize and resupply. This unintended pause proved critical for the Soviets. Stalin seized the opportunity to bring in reinforcements, reorganize defenses, and prepare Moscow for a decisive stand. 11 new armies were formed, including 30 divisions of hardened Siberian soldiers who had been transferred from the east after Stalin confirmed that Japan did not intend to attack the Soviet Far East. These troops were well equipped for winter warfare and far better suited to the deteriorating weather than their German counterparts. Additionally, 1,000 new tanks arrived, ready to reinforce the capital's defenses. As temperatures plummeted, the muddy ground froze solid. Now the terrain favored movement once again, and on November 15th, the Germans renewed their offensive. Their plan was complex but carefully structured. The 3rd and 4th Panzer armies would push across the Moscow-Volga Canal and attempt to envelop the city from the northeast. From the south, the 2nd Panzer Group would attack Tula and drive northward, completing a massive encirclement of Moscow. Meanwhile, the 4th Army in the center would strike directly toward the city itself, exploiting any weakness created by the Soviet forces shifting to counter the flanking movements. The Germans fought with grim determination. Despite shortages of ammunition, fuel, and winter gear, they forced their way forward in freezing conditions. Frostbite claimed thousands of soldiers, engines malfunctioned in the bitter cold, and weapons jammed. Yet the Wehrmacht continued to advance, pressing closer to Moscow's final defensive ring. In the south, however, the Soviet defenders held firm. On November 22nd, they stopped the 2nd Panzer Group in its tracks near Tula, preventing the Germans from completing the southern arm of their encirclement. At the same time, Soviet counterattacks intensified along the northern and central sectors, gradually slowing the German momentum. The dreams of a swift conquest of Moscow began to fade as December approached. German troops were exhausted, supplies were critically low, and the promised new winter equipment had not arrived. Soviet forces, strengthened by Siberian divisions and better prepared for the extreme cold, launched a massive counteroffensive in early December. The Red Army pushed the Germans back from the outskirts of the capital, forcing them to abandon their positions and retreat westward. For the first time since the start of Barbarossa, the Germans suffered a major strategic defeat. Hitler and his commanders realized that their lightning war, so successful across Europe, had reached its limits in the vastness of the Soviet Union. The war that they had expected to win quickly had now become a grueling, prolonged struggle for survival against an enemy with immense manpower, industrial capacity, and growing international support. Operation Barbarossa marked the turning point of the Second World War. Although Germany would continue to wage fierce battles on the Eastern Front for nearly 4 more years, the failure to seize Moscow and break the Soviet Union in 1941 sealed the fate of the Third Reich. The invasion, conceived as a bold blow to destroy communism and expand German domination, instead became the beginning of a catastrophic conflict that Germany could not hope to sustain. As the snows deepened across the Russian landscape, the myth of the invincible Wehrmacht began to fracture, and the Soviet Union emerged, bloodied, battered, but unbroken, ready to push its enemies back across the continent. The German drive toward Moscow, which only weeks earlier had seemed unstoppable, was beginning to lose momentum as the weather worsened and Soviet resistance solidified. Yet in late November 1940, the Wehrmacht still believed victory was within reach. The Germans pushed relentlessly, trying to break through the last defensive belts that protected the Soviet capital. Siberian units, hardened by the brutal climates of the Far East, arrived in large numbers and soon launched fierce counterattacks. These fresh divisions, better adapted to extreme cold and battle-ready after years of frontier duty, managed to halt and defeat the German 2nd Panzer Army in the south. The sudden blow forced the attackers back and disrupted their plans to encircle Moscow from the lower flank. However, even as the southern threat crumbled, the German 4th Panzer Group pressed on with stubborn determination, countering Soviet pressure and managing to drive Soviet forces backward near the northern axis of attack. Through sheer effort and continued assaults, they reached and crossed the Moscow-Volga Canal, the last major natural barrier between them and the city itself. For a brief moment, it appeared that the Wehrmacht might succeed in breaching the very edge of the Soviet capital. Elements of the German 7th Panzer Division moved ahead rapidly, braving freezing temperatures, exhaustion, and dwindling supplies. These forward units pushed to within 22 miles of Red Square and the Kremlin. To the soldiers marching through frozen forests and ruined villages, it seemed as if the war's decisive moment was at hand. Yet that was as far as this group would ever get. On November 28th, a massive and well-coordinated Soviet counterattack slammed into their lines. The unexpected onslaught, supported by artillery and fresh manpower, forced the weary German troops to retreat. The dream of capturing Moscow in 1941 was beginning to dissolve. Northwest of the capital, other German formations advanced toward the town of Krasnaya Polyana, now known as Lobnya, reaching a point just 18 miles from the Kremlin. That distance was so close that many officers believed they might glimpse Moscow's landmarks in the distance. But despite their proximity, their advance ground to a halt. Stiff Soviet resistance, mounting casualties, and severe supply shortages stalled them completely. Fuel was scarce, ammunition even more so, and the temperatures continued to fall. German commanders knew the clock was working against them. The success of their earlier blitzkrieg tactics depended on speed, mobility, and short campaigns, conditions that no longer existed on the frozen plains outside Moscow. Still, some German units edged even closer. The 250th Infantry Division, known as the Blue Division, composed of Spanish volunteers allied with Germany, managed to push ahead. A subunit of the division, the Panzer Pioneer Battalion, found what they believed was a gap in the Soviet defensive lines. Acting quickly and without the usual armored support, a small detachment moved through the breach on December 2, 1941. Light vehicles and motorcycle pairs advanced along icy roads toward the small township of Khimki, near today's Sheremetyevo Airport and close to what is now the Moscow Ring Road. According to later accounts, officers claimed that from their position near Khimki, they could see the golden domes of Moscow's churches and the towers of the Kremlin glinting in the distance. The idea that German troops saw Moscow's skyline became one of the most frequently repeated legends of the Eastern Front. Years later, visitors who passed through Khimki sometimes imagined that same moment. The thought of exhausted German soldiers peering across the snow-covered horizon, believing they were glimpsing the city that symbolized the heart of their enemy. Yet the story is likely exaggerated, if not entirely mistaken. Moscow in 1941 was mostly low-rise and spread out, so the Kremlin's towers would indeed have stood above the skyline. But the Soviets had gone to enormous lengths to camouflage the city. The famous golden domes and gilded spires had been painted in dark, dull colors so they would not reflect sunlight. The Kremlin walls had been redesigned with paint to resemble rows of apartment buildings, masking their true shape from aerial reconnaissance. On Red Square, wooden frames and plywood structures altered the appearance of streets and landmarks so dramatically that even pilots flying overhead struggled to identify them. Lenin's mausoleum, normally a highly recognizable structure, had been disguised as an unremarkable two-story residential building. Under such extensive camouflage, it would have been extremely difficult for German soldiers at Khimki to recognize the Kremlin from such a distance. It is more likely that the soldiers misinterpreted sunlight glinting off frozen rooftops or mistook smaller church towers for the Kremlin's spires. Khimki itself had no high vantage points in 1941, making a clear view of the distant city improbable. Yet the legend endured, perhaps because it symbolized how close the Germans had come, yet how ultimately they still failed. What is certain, however, is that Khimki represented the Wehrmacht's farthest point of advance toward Moscow. The small group of German troops that reached the town paused, expecting reinforcements that never arrived. They waited in the bitter cold, surrounded by uncertainty, unable to move forward but unwilling to retreat. On December 3rd, their isolation ended abruptly when a local Soviet militia unit, reinforced by a few T-34 tanks, counterattacked. The Germans were pushed out of Khimki, marking the end of any forward progress toward the capital. Today, the point marking Germany's farthest advance is commemorated by massive steel Czech hedgehogs, tank traps placed at kilometer 23 along the Leningrad Highway, ironically next to a large modern IKEA store. The memorial symbolizes both how close and how far the Germans came in their attempt to conquer the city. As December progressed, winter tightened its grip on the front. Temperatures plunged lower than anything the poorly equipped German soldiers had been prepared for. Boots cracked, weapons jammed, and engines froze solid overnight. Winds howled across open fields, cutting through thin uniforms designed for quick summer offensives rather than prolonged winter warfare. Snowstorms battered the front lines, and supply deliveries slowed to a crawl. For the first time since the campaign began, the Wehrmacht was no longer advancing. It was barely surviving. On December 5th, the German offensive finally stalled completely. The exhaustion of the troops, the failure of supply lines, and the brutal climate made further progress impossible. 2 days later, on December 7th, the Soviet High Command launched a massive counteroffensive all along the Moscow front. Entirely fresh armies, many brought from Siberia after Soviet intelligence confirmed Japan would not attack in the Far East, now surged forward. Their troops wore thick white winter camouflage, and their equipment functioned reliably in temperatures that paralyzed German machinery. Supported by artillery, ski troops, and newly formed tank brigades, the Red Army struck in wave after wave. The German lines, already stretched to the breaking point, buckled under the impact. Villages and towns that had been seized in the frantic push toward Moscow were retaken by Soviet forces. German divisions found themselves fighting simply to avoid encirclement, a bitter reversal of the very tactics they had used so successfully months earlier. Frostbite caused more casualties than bullets, and men weakened by hunger and exhaustion struggled to hold their rifles steady. Where once German soldiers believed they would capture Moscow and end the war, they now realized they were locked in a desperate battle for survival in one of the harshest winters in history. By January 7, 1942, the Soviet counteroffensive finally halted, but its results were profound. The Red Army had pushed the Germans back between 60 and 150 miles from the city. Villages that had seen German helmets weeks earlier were now back under Soviet control. The threat to Moscow had been broken. Hitler's hope of capturing the Soviet capital in 1941 had collapsed entirely. The battle for Moscow was over, and with it ended the myth of German invincibility. The Eastern Front would now stretch on for years, consuming millions of lives in a conflict unlike anything the world had seen before.